Welcome to the fifth installment of my absolute beginner's guide to the last spell. In the last episode, we talked all about what makes heroes tick, but we left out one important detail because what is a hero without their trusty weapon? So let's dive into all the ins and outs of all of the weapons of the last spell. So first off, welcome. There are a lot of new viewers out there, and I appreciate you all tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk all about what is probably the most defining element of a hero in the last spell, and that is the weapons that you choose to equip them with. Because without weapons, heroes have punch and jump over, and maybe an armor ability. But all of their offensive abilities are coming from their weapons, and the weapons that you choose to equip them with defines basically their class, going back to the discussion that we had last time about the classless nature of the last spell. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to start out and we're going to go through each of the weapons, each of their skills, their strengths, their weaknesses, and then a few pairings that I think work particularly well with them. We're not going to go full into builds per se, but I do want to cover all of the weapons because understanding the capabilities and capacity of a weapon is critical to choosing the right weapons for the problems that you're trying to solve. So first on the list is the trusty one-handed sword equipped here on Chiron. And the one-handed sword has three abilities on it. The first of which is your bread and butter. You get to slice enemies 4 times, and slice is an ability that is modified by momentum. That means the further that you move, the harder that you hit. It also has the modifier follow, which means that after you kill an enemy with slice, you will take the tile that they are in. The second ability is dash, and dash is essentially a jump over ability. It gives you the ability to jump over a tile and do damage to it as you can. One thing that's important to note about dash is you'll notice that the range indicator has 2 modifier icons on it. We'll talk about these modifiers as they come up. I'm not going to kind of go through all of them at the beginning, but the 2 that we have here, the first one is orthogonal, and that you can see that displayed here, but basically it means that you will only be able to attack on the cardinal directions. And then the second is skill range, which means that as your character's skill range increases, the distance that you can travel with this ability also increases. The reason that we currently have 2 skill range is because we have the ability steady aim, which I thought would be useful for demonstrating this. So right now you can see that I could move 2 tiles and land in the third. However, if I move 1, deactivating steady aim, then you'll see that I only have the ability to jump over 1 tile. The last, but certainly not least ability on the sword is Blade Rush, and Blade Rush is essentially dash on steroids. It hits 3 enemies rather than 1, but comes at a mana cost and does significantly more damage. So that's the movesets, and what I'd like to do now is just give you a sample turn of the way I might play with this particular weapon. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move forward 2. You can see the momentum indicator shows that we've moved 2 tiles, which means we're getting 50% extra damage from slash, which means that this is a guaranteed kill. Then I might loop back around here, choose to use blade dash to kill the front 3 enemies here, before using dash to kill this enemy, or in this case, miss. Importantly, and I think that this is one of the strengths of the sword, you not only have the ability to attack with dash, but you also have the ability to use dash as a mobility only effect. And when you do that, you can see that you still have access to the undo button. So we can use this like a movement in order to get back out by the end of the turn. So that's why I generally think of the sword as a mobility weapon, because as your skill range goes up, dash allows you to cover huge amounts of distance. Blade Rush is doing fairly large damage, and once you've done all that distance, you're then going to be able to use slice to deal a bunch of damage. I would say the weaknesses of this weapon is really that its damage almost entirely hinges on slice and the occasional blade rush. Blade rush is a little expensive, though. Uh, when thinking about pairings for this weapon, I think it pairs well with other momentum-based weapons. So it works well with a scepter, a pistol. You could also potentially play it reasonably well with a dagger or other weapons that require you to get into specific positions. That I think is its best potential application. That brings us to the older brother of the sword, the two-handed sword. The two-handed sword has 4 abilities, the first of which is a slash ability that deals damage to the 2 enemies directly in front of you. It is notably 2 action points worth of cost. Then the second ability is thrust, which is a single target attack, point blank, that has momentum scaling associated with it. The third ability is Charge, which is kind of similar to the Blade Dash previously mentioned, but has a longer range to it, and you terminate at the beginning of the damage area as opposed to traveling across it. And then last but certainly not least is Sword Blast, which is a point-blank 6-pack style AoE attack. Noteworthy about Sword Blast, I don't think that's the way swords work. Go figure. To go through these moves and play through them a little bit, I might move up here. I might use the momentum tack once again to get that. Then I would move back 1 tile because you can't charge unless you can move back 1. And then I might charge these 3 enemies. Then moving into location here for a slash and a rather ineffective sword blast to finish it up. The strengths of this weapon are definitely charge because it is relatively high damage, moderately cheap, used to be cheaper, and does a fair amount of damage and gives you a lot of mobility, and then also the momentum attack is relatively cheap. The downside of the two-handed sword is unquestionably the fact that its primary attack costs so much AP, it can be very hard to fund. And then also because Sword Blast is the 6 contiguous units shape that we were discussing before, it can be very hard to get full value out of it. But when you do, 3 mana to essentially probably kill 6 enemies is pretty solid. Weapons that I like to pair with the two-handed sword are weapons that cut across as opposed to the semi-piercing of this weapon. So I like axes, two-handed axes. I think it can also be used in some momentum builds, so you might be able to pair it with a pistol. But the two-handed sword doesn't get a lot of use in my gameplay. With the swords out of the way, it is hammer time. And the first hammer we're going to look at is the one-handed hammer. It has 3 abilities on it. The first is Bash, usable 5 times with a relatively high base damage, and it costs a single action point to use. Second, we have Crush, which is modifiable by skill range and an orthogonal attack that hits 2 enemies in a line. And then last but not least, we have Stomp, which is a point-blank ability that hits 9 tiles in a square, although you consume 1 of them, so I guess it's technically 8. It does damage to the middle, but stuns all of the remaining tiles. To do a little bit of a turn here, we might come in and bash. We might move over, use Crush to hit the back 2. Hit this guy with 1 more of those, and then come in for the Stomp there to see what we can do. Now, in terms of strengths, I think its primary attack is relatively high damage, so it is good for taking out single targets, even relatively strong ones. And then I think Crush is surprisingly cheap, especially given that it scales off of opportunism. You have a lot of flexibility with Crush to do those extra little bits of damage here and there. Overall, I think that its weaknesses are a lack of flexibility. It doesn't really have any large AoE attacks. I think the fact that Stomp is doing reduced damage to the surroundings, it can still be a relatively large amount of damage, but at 2 mana cost, it feels a little overpriced. So overall, I believe that the hammer is best suited for opportunism builds, which means that it's going to be pairing well with power staffs, axes, and the occasional two-handed hammer. Unlike its little brother, the two-handed hammer is no slouch, probably one of my favorite weapons in the game. It comes with a primary attack hammer strike that deals large damage to a single target, stunning all additional units in a ring around it for damage, modifiable by skill range. And that's very important. We'll come back to that. Then next is follow up, which provides a skill range scaling follow ability so that you can move in quickly to get to where you need to go, assuming you can secure the kill. It does additional opportunism damage on the same scaling as crush, so that's important to note and makes this a beautiful weapon to use in opportunism builds. Then we have Mega Stomp, which is a propagation ability that bounces up to 5 times, doing heavy damage and debuffing the damage of folks that it comes in contact with. I wouldn't say that I use that very frequently. But then last but not least, we have Ground Stomp, which hits in a plus shape, is skill modifiable, and hits up to 5 targets once per turn and is undodgeable. So as an example of how you might utilize these, we might use our follow ability to skip over the units here and get into the thick of things. We might then use our primary attack to try to secure as many stuns as humanly possible. That was less than it could have been. But then if we step over here, we have the ability to hit this guy with a Mega Stomp, demonstrating Propagate for the first time. And then we can close off with a nice old-fashioned Ground Stomp to secure 4 more kills. So you can see the two-handed hammer has a lot of damage dealing potential. I think its strengths really lie in its basic abilities, Hammer Strike and Follow Up. I think that Mega Stomp has its applications, certainly, and Ground Stomp I will use from time to time when I see opportunities to get a full 5 target with it, but you're definitely taking it for the first 2. The weaknesses here are really just the limited uses. You only have 3 hammer strikes and 2 follow-ups available each turn. So this is a very poor weapon to use as a singular weapon and really needs a second weapon to kind of fill in the gaps and do the rest of the work. In terms of matchups, I think this fits beautifully into opportunism builds. The follow-up synergy is brilliant. Also, Hammer Strike is beautiful because you are applying a stun, even if it's low percentage, and then you can use things like Contamination from the debuff in an opportunism build to potentially make that work. And then I think Ground Smash is one of the easier to enable AoE abilities. It's easier to find pluses than certain other shapes in the game. So overall, a relatively strong weapon. If hammers aren't your thing, maybe it's all about the axes. And the first axe that we are going to talk about is the one-handed axe. The one-handed axe has 3 abilities. It has Shred, which is a point-blank attack that hits 3 across, but notably comes with a 1.25x scaling on opportunism and can be used 5 times. I think that's one of the bread and butter values of the axe. Then next you have Intimidating Scream, which has vision, which means that it cannot be blocked by any line of sight impediments. Hits a 6-pack with a debuff for minus 33% damage. That will be important in just a moment. And then last but not least, you have Axe or Boomerang, which is, it hits in, I'm calling it right now a mustache shape. But it hits in a mustache shape, aligned orthogonally with you, scaling off of skill range for 2 action points and 3 mana. Now, I mentioned that we would talk about Intimidating Scream because if you remember back to the one-handed hammer, my biggest complaint with it was that it did not have an enabler for your opportunism. Well, the axe has a solution to that problem because having a 1 AP cost debuff like this enables you to gain the benefit of opportunism on up to basically 2 sets of attacks, which is particularly useful. Then we can go ahead and try out Axe Boomerang here and almost get a full dealie out of it, but a very satisfying swipe pattern there. And then we can go ahead and maybe do a little bit more debuffing. But the strengths of the axe are almost entirely built into Shred. Early on, it is self-contained because it can provide the debuffs that are necessary to get you the opportunism scaling. Axe Boomerang is fine. It does enough damage, and I would say that its attack pattern is one of the easier ones to utilize because you'll often have a wave with some depth variance to it. But the beautiful thing about the axe is that as you graduate to new weapons, Shred is only going to get better and better. Like when you pair the axe with a power staff, you can hit a unit back one from you and debuff the whole front line with Shred, often leading to 4 kills for 2 actions. The weaknesses of the axe, I would say, really come down to the fact that since it's not really scaling meaningfully off of skill range, aka Shred is point blank, you need to have a lot of mobility in order to make it sing. As I've already alluded to in terms of favorite matches, I think Power Staff is number 1, but it can also do relatively well when paired with a hammer or other kind of opportunism enablers. The two-handed axe does not have all the benefits of its younger sibling, but it comes with 4 abilities. The first of which is Swing, which is an ultra-wide 5 across attack costing 2 action points. Then Leap, which is a manaless maneuver ability that saps 2 action points from all of the people directly around where you land. This is kind of like the hero landing type of thing. Then it has a peculiar buff in Berserker Rage that comes at a cost of 1 action point and 1 mana, but increases your damage while reducing your resistance. As a reminder, negative resistance is an increase in damage from enemies. And then last but not least is Super Spin, or as I tend to call it, Spin to Win, which is a 12 target point blank spinning AoE. To put these into effect can sometimes be a little difficult. You will find that this is one of my biggest complaints about the axe, is that it is often hard to find targets, but we can use the leap to jump in. Then maybe we go for a Berserker Rage because in this case there is no future for us, so doing more damage is probably for the best. Then the best we can do because of the terrain is to hit 3 with our primary attack. And then just to show off all of the abilities, we will move in for a relatively underwhelming Spin to Win. But that gives you a handle on the kit, and I think the strengths of the two-handed axe are first and foremost Berserker Rage. I think that the increase in damage for a relatively nominal cost for 2 turns is particularly effective and makes it very pairable with a lot of standalone weapons that you can use an entire turn with. I also think that Leap not having a mana cost makes it quite effective for getting around. You can see that it is orthogonal and skill range, which means you can use it to leap in, do some damage, leap back out again. I think that Swing and Super Spin are both relatively cumbersome if we start to talk about weaknesses. It is almost impossible to get a Super Spin that hits all 12 enemies, and Swing, it is very rare to have a perfectly lined up set of enemies. And the damage is usually a little lacking to secure all 5 kills, even if you do. And it comes with the inaccurate modifier, which means that against dodge, it is going to be twice or 1.5x times as bad. So I think the axe is interesting. It pairs well with weapons that don't require you to use either swing or super spin. So I'm thinking like wand is a great choice. You could probably use it as an offhand with a hand crossbow to provide some mobility and a bit of damage up. Now we have perhaps not the strongest melee weapon, but also perhaps thematically my favorite. It is the Dagger. The Dagger comes at you with 3 abilities. Backstab, which is a point blank, high isolation scaling melee damage that you can use up to 5 times. I love skills that you can use 5 times. Then Throwing Dagger, which is a similarly high damage, skill range modifiable, single target damage attack that is unblockable, so gets through that block. And then last but not least, Poison Daggers, which is a 2 AP 3 mana, relatively low damage, skill range modifiable, 4 multi-hit poison attack. So if we were to play out a turn here, what I might do is take a step in, then immediately use my Thrown Dagger to snipe that guy off, making this guy isolated so we get a nice big attack on them, and then go for our first multi-hit attack of the campaign, I believe, where I might go with something like that, hoping to get some good isolations out of that, which we did not get. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then just give a little stab there. So in terms of strengths, I think the reason you take Dagger is to go for either an isolation build or a poison build. And then I think that Throwing Dagger gives you some nice utility in the middle. I find that Throwing Dagger does a bunch of damage, but if you're going isolation, it's going to be all about setting up successful backstabs and then getting that large isolation damage out of it. And if you're going for more of a poison build, it's going to be about getting poison scaling and getting multi-hit in order to be able to hit up to 9 targets with your poison damage. I have yet to try and build daggers with a poison build, but I think it has a lot of potential viability. So its strengths are definitely in the builds that it contributes to, and its weaknesses we kind of saw here, which is that if you are unable to successfully get your isolated targets, then you can fail to get the kills on them, and you can end up with a pretty middling turn overall. In terms of favorite matches, I think it pairs well with weapons that allow you to get into position. So I'm thinking things like the sword, which is also a melee weapon, but I also think that you could potentially do some interesting things like pair it with a Druid Staff and go for a hybrid poison build, sometimes using poison from your poison daggers, sometimes using poison from bees on the Druid Staff. I also feel like it can pair particularly well with any kind of high damage, high AoE type of build. You really are doing very targeted, very specific damage with the dagger, so having something that does AoE like a hand crossbow or even maybe a Tome of Secrets could potentially pair relatively well. I also sometimes find myself pairing spear and dagger together, although I'm not sure there's a huge amount of synergy. So the spear is not a two-handed dagger. Not sure exactly what it is, but the spear has 4 abilities. You have Impale, which is a 3 in front of you attack. You have Rush, which is a 2 in front of you attack, but that has momentum scaling on it. You have Flurry of Strikes, which is a 3 multi-hit that is undodgeable for moderately high damage, scaling off of skill range. And then last but not least, you have Triple Swipe, which is a large conical AoE attack. Now, the way I would play a turn like this is I might move to here. I might utilize Thrust to secure a couple of kills before moving in and either going for a Skewer, or in this case, I might jump straight to a rather expensive Triple Swipe, taking out less than its potential maximum, and then finishing off with Flurry of Strikes to just take out, hopefully, 3 baddies. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is this is the first weapon that we have not had the ability to use all of its abilities in a single turn with 6 action points. And that is the first weakness that I would like to describe about the spear, which is that all of its abilities cost 2 AP, so it is a very hungry weapon. Additionally, Triple Swipe, which has a lot of wow factor, is staggeringly expensive from a mana cost at 5 mana cost. And Flurry of Strikes has lost some of its luster. Previously, it was armor piercing, Now it's undodgeable. I do not think that that is a good trade. So overall, there's some issues. But the biggest issue with the spear, I think, is that both triple swipe and also impale and rush struggle from being expensive and hard to utilize to their full capacity. If I were to pick a place that I most often use spears, I think its favorite match is not going to be a weapon so much as Blood Mage, because I think that Triple Swipe and Blood Mage with Vampirism and also Flurry of Strikes can turn you into a bit of a healing machine with all of the kills that you're potentially getting. But overall, I think the spear still lags a bit behind, and I rarely utilize it as a weapon. So that rounds out the melee weapons. Now we're going to move on to the ranged weapons, the first of which is the Shortbow. And the Shortbow comes at us with 4 abilities, the first of which is Straight Arrow. The previous incarnation of this was Undodgeable, but I guess they felt that the Shortbow had too many tricks up its sleeves, so now this is just a regular old damage-based attack, and this is the first time that you will see the rings. And the rings that I'm referring to are these concentric diamonds, and they indicate levels of inaccuracy. So as we kind of move our way out, you're going to see that the dodge chance increases as you are further away from your target with Straight Arrow. Then you have Power Shot, which is a much more limited range and deals much higher damage. Then you have Tight Volley, which is your standard 6-pack. And last but not least, you have Rain of Arrows that hits in kind of like an infinity shape. One thing that we should talk about now that we're into the ranged space is when the center of your targeting reticule is along a 45-degree diagonal, pressing the F key will rotate it back and forth. People sometimes see me do that and they wonder how that's happening. But as you can see here, we could do it this way or we could do it this way. So let's see, if we wanted to do a basic turn, let's say we were most worried about the fast movers. So I often like to open up with Rain of Arrows, which is one of my favorite skills. It is high mana cost, but has a tendency to hit like a freaking truck, and also creates a lot of isolated targets more often than not. After that was cleaned up, I might move in for a quick power shot or two, before moving back a bit and finishing up with a few straight arrows. Overall, the identity of the Shortbow from my perspective is kind of a mid-range ranged weapon. So you're mostly doing relatively close combat. You're relying heavily on Rain of Arrows because of its high damage and also vision. I didn't mention that before, but it cannot be obstructed. And then you're using Power Shot to take out a few of the medium-sized enemies and cleaning up runners and things like that with straight arrows. The weakness of this is that I do not think it has anything in its kit that is particularly well suited for dealing with high armor or high block enemies. There's no real mitigation available. I should mention that Tight Volley comes with a -2 movement points, which is also really nice for kind of slowing down those big enemies. But overall, I would say that it is a well-rounded weapon that just lacks a bit in terms of overall punch outside of Rain of Arrows. I really enjoy mixing the Shortbow with anything that needs a little extra range. So even some melee weapons like Shortbow can play really well with Dagger by having Rain of Arrows generate a lot of isolated units. Or it can also play well for weapons that have a relatively high minimum range, like Longbow Shortbow can be a really nice combination. And speaking of Longbow, here it is. The Longbow has 4 abilities, the first of which is Long Shot, which is the first time that we're seeing minimum skill range outside of the hammer, which notably also has some challenges around minimum skill range. But Long Shot is really a kind of like the distance-based dagger. So it has isolation scaling, it has relatively long range, and hits with a medium punch. The next ability is a buff ability, Watch Out. The percentage dodge scales off of the level of the longbow. So at the top end, I think you're doing over 50% dodge, which is pretty transformative, and you should not be sleeping on watch out if you have two heroes that are on the same side. Next up is Snipe Shot, which is a quite high damage, undodgeable single target attack that costs 2 movement, 2 mana, and 1 action point. The 2 mana makes this one a bit limiting, but this can put up some serious damage, and the fact that it is undodgeable gives you a bit of flexibility. I think now that the Shortbow doesn't have undodgeable on its primary attack, Snipe Shot has a little more value in its particular kit. And then last but not least, we have Arctic Blast, which does a medium amount of damage to a 3x3 area with a relatively high stun chance for 2 mana. So if I were starting out this turn, the first thing that we're going to notice is I need to get a bit of distance to be able to do much of anything. So I might open up with this as our kind of best option. And then I might actually retreat and go for a few runners here. Probably considering the possibility of going for a second Arctic Blast and skipping Sniper Shot, since there's nobody particularly high damage, nobody particularly high HP for us to take out here. But I think that this turn really solidified the identity. The identity of this weapon is really all about isolation. You're trying to do single target damage to a small number of high value targets like bulkies or boomers, and then you're also getting some wave delay out of Arctic Blast, which with a little bit of stun chance actually is surprisingly effective at providing you with some stopping power. And then Snipe Shot is useful from time to time for taking out those big enemies as well. But the weakness here is pretty clear. You don't have a great answer to how to deal with large waves of enemies, even though Arctic Blast can do a fairly large amount of damage down the line. You're really limited to kind of a single archetype, and that archetype is really isolation. And now onto the hand crossbow, a weapon that if you had asked me right after reading the patch notes how it was going to be, I would have assumed that it was nerfed into oblivion. That is not the case. Spoiler alert. So the hand crossbow has always been defined by its first primary attack, which is called Quick Shot, that deals damage twice for a small amount at a relatively low skill range with a bit of range inaccuracy, as you can see by the 2 concentric rings here. This ability picked up in the most recent patch Armor Piercing, which means that against enemies that have armor, I think we have none here, it would do damage without needing to take away the ablative armor first. The second ability is Slow Death. Slow Death now has a relatively high base poison that it applies, along with a -2 movement points at a moderate range, without the same skill inaccuracy. And then last but certainly not least is Blaze, usable 3 times now. It is a 4x propagate, relatively high damage attack with the same 7 range that hits up to 4 targets. Now, this, for those of you that played before, you will know that previously Quickshot had a snare associated with it, and Blaze had multi-shot and propagate, which was always problematic because no matter how much they nerfed it, it was still exceptionally good. But to play out a sample turn here, since Blaze only costs 1 action, I might open with a Blaze to get a bit of propagate, and then follow up with a little bit of damage from my hand crossbow to clean things up. And then maybe we recognize that this guy is going to be a bit of a pain, and so we'll hit them with the poison, do a little bit more multi-hitting, and then close with maybe 1 more Blaze to see if we can pick up a few more kills. So the hand crossbow is very strong. Blaze in particular scales well off of propagation and becomes very, very strong. It hits exceptionally hard, and if you start to build a lot of crit and damage, Blaze is going to be wiping out entire columns of enemies. Additionally, if you have the perk volatile reaction, which we do not have here, you're going to find that Blaze is going to start spreading like wildfire. Additionally, quick shot does a bunch of damage. You need a bit of resistance reduction in order to make it work, but the armor piercing means it is exceptionally good for taking out spearmen and the like. And then you still have some snare in your kit, although this is significantly less effective, and I don't think the poison is super meaningful. I can't imagine using a hand crossbow in a poison build. The weaknesses of this weapon is that it takes some stats to get it going. Before you pick up some multi-hit, the primary attack is relatively limited, and before you pick up some propagation and propagation damage, Blaze is not hitting like the truck that it will eventually. But with proper investment, this is probably one of my favorite weapons in the game. It can be pretty standalone, but it pairs well with wands because you're going to be picking up quite a bit of multi-hit. It also pairs well with Tome of Secrets because you're going to be picking up a lot of propagation damage, and those lightning propagates can be pretty debilitating. And then I think you can also pair it with a fair number of other things, but actually two-handed axes would be another good example because of the damage buff that comes with them, but it's a pretty versatile weapon and a bit standalone once you get a bit of multi-hit. The regular crossbow, or not so hand crossbow, as it were, comes with 4 abilities. First, you have straight shot, which has a relatively high range, but a lot of inaccuracy built in as the dodge modifier increases. Then it has heavy bolt, which is an orthogonal ability, modifiable by skill range, but relatively high damage. You have impaling bolt, which is a 4 in a row attack, similarly orthogonal. And then last but not least, explosive bolt at a 3 mana cost that's going to be hitting 5. Now, as you can imagine, with a character of this type, getting some range is particularly important because of min ranges, but I might open with a impaling bolt to get a bit of damage in. Then we might hit this guy with a heavy bolt just because the inaccuracy paying dividends there. Fire off a explosive shot, and then use our last 2 attacks from straight shot to do a bit more damage. The strengths of the crossbow are an exceptionally high base damage. It hits really, really hard. Heavy bolt requires a bit of movement to make it work. As you could see after we did the impaling bolt, we didn't have really anyone on our axes, but when it hits, it's one of the hardest hitting 1 AP attacks. And then the fact that it is unblockable also means that you have the ability to really put in some damage against larger foes. I've already mentioned my affinity for plus-shaped attacks. I think you can often find 4 targets and sometimes 5 targets to kill. And then I do think Impaling Bolt, if you have a bit of a choke point like this one here, can find a fair number of targets, although I generally find that for the 2 mana, it's a little on the weak side. The weakness of this weapon is really in positioning. 2 of its attacks having orthogonal on them, and then also having a min range on your 2 1 AP cost attacks are somewhat limiting factors that make it a bit of a challenge to fully utilize the hand crossbow. Excuse me, the regular crossbow. Overall, I think that the crossbow fits well into a place where you need single target damage. So I could see it pairing with a lot of things like longbows, shortbows, maybe even things like swords. I haven't really tried that, but anything that gives a little bit of mobility, like the pistol potentially, could maybe benefit from having a few heavy bolts to dole out and the occasional explosive shot. I could also see it being useful paired with weapons that are more about kind of slow killing and don't have a lot of answers for big enemies, so maybe like a Druid Staff, for instance. The pistol is vying for probably my single favorite weapon in the game currently, because I love some of the changes that they've recently made. So to go through the pistol's kit, first we have Pistol Shot, which is one of the higher scaling momentum damage attacks in the game. It also is unblockable, which means it's going to be doing great work against bulkies and the like. Then we have Grappling Shot, which comes with Isolation, which is a new addition and follow. While it is on a orthogonal axis, it has it packs a fairly good punch, and the follow allows you to build up some of your momentum for Pistol Shot. And then Grape Shot Blast is a lot like Triple Shot, except it has a skill range associated with it. So I might play this turn by moving going to say here and then picking up the kill on this guy, then I have a large momentum shot available to me. We're at momentum 6 right now, so our pistol shot is being increased by 144%. Blow that guy up for a bunch of damage, and then maybe we take our grape shot blast and level all of those fools, and then maybe on our way out of town well, would we? I feel like I might gamble to try and get the second grappling shot there, and then if I fail, I'll just shoot this guy up. But as you can see, the grappling shot having follow on it and having isolation on it really means that in situations unlike this, like in this situation, all of our enemies are relatively tightly packed because of some of the funnels that are created here. But in a lot of situations, it makes for some really interesting gameplay. You're looking for how you can grapple shot from enemy to enemy that are isolated, so you're putting out a lot of damage on them, utilizing your pistol shots to knock some people down, and then you have a more flexible triple swipe that is undodgeable to kind of level large portions of the enemy base. I think the pistol has a lot of everything going on. It's a nice mobility weapon. It packs a good punch, has some decent AoE. If anything, I would say that its weakness is maybe that I wish it had one more pistol shot, and also I wish that maybe grape shot was a little less expensive, but it's a great weapon to pair with a sword, to pair with a dagger, to pair with a scepter. In all of those cases, it's going to perform exceptionally well in any type of mobility-centric build. The Humble Rifle got some interesting adjustments with the most recent patch, but to run you through its kit really quickly, we have Rifle Shot, which is a high damage 2 action point attack you can use up to 3 times that is undodgeable. You then have Hip Shot, which has a very high inaccuracy fall off, all the way up to 3.6 times dodge at the maximum distance. And then you have Suppressive Fire, which is one of the largest AoEs in the game, and comes with a staggering 3% move and minus 40% accuracy, and also some minor damage at a cost of 2 mana and 2 AP. And then last but not least, you have Assassinate, which is costing you some movement, 2 mana and 2 action points, but is high damage, high isolation scaling, and unblockable. So the big headlining change to the rifle is really the addition of opportunism on Hip Shot, and it's made me rethink the weapon quite a bit. But if I were to play out this turn, I think what I would probably do is I would probably hit this column with Suppressive Fire, essentially completely rooting all of them in place. And then I might move up a little bit and use my Hip Shot to take out a few of the enemies that I have debuffed. And then we're going to pretend that this guy over here, actually I'm going to move a little bit less, but we're going to pretend that one of these guys over here is particularly nasty, and I'm going to go ahead and hit him with Assassination for that, or Assassinate with that for that big damage. But the real strength of the rifle, if we were to talk about that, is Suppressive Fire. This is an incredible snare. It has the ability to stop in its tracks a huge host of enemies, and in a lot of situations, that means that someone with a rifle can kind of single-handedly keep most of a wave back off your walls for a surprisingly long period of time. And even if they're at your walls, the 40% accuracy reduction is also pretty strong. But Hip Shot has given this some new life and some new interest, because I think that now it has the potential to dabble in opportunism builds. I could see you potentially playing a Hip Shot Suppressive Fire type of thing with maybe a one-handed axe, or maybe even a power staff under some circumstances, using Suppressive Fire followed by Scorching Wave. But its weakness is definitely in the fact that you are limited to only 3 hip shots, and your rifle shots are very, very expensive. So kind of your bread and butter ability is just really costly, and this is something that is going to be a theme things that have a primary attack that costs 2, I find to be relatively unusable. And I won't go into too much detail as to why, but what it basically boils down to for me is that if you build these weapons correctly, even the cheap one-handed weapon attacks are going to be hitting for large amounts of damage. I had a run yesterday where I had a one-handed wand that was hitting for 3,000 damage per hit with its baseline attack. And while the rifle shot here might be hitting for 5,000, you're primarily killing enemies that don't have that much hit points. So rifle shot is hugely wasteful on all of them. And then the same is true for two-handed swords and a lot of other weapons. But overall, I'm curious to play more with the rifle, but I think things that I'm thinking about pairing it with are one-handed axes and various other things like power staffs, opportunism builds in general. I've also had some luck playing it particularly decently with Druid Staff, interestingly enough. You throw out some poison, then you use some hip shots to clean up the baddies. 2 down, 1 to go. It's time to start talking about the magic weapons. And the first one on our list is the Humble Wand. The wand's primary attack is Sword of Damocles, which is a 1 action point, moderate damage, somewhat limited in terms of its minimum skill range attack that is undodgeable. That was a recent change up. Then we have Transfer, which sadly we can't use because it needs to be cast on another target other than yourself, but it grants them 1 action point, 2 movement, and then the owner of the wand gets an 11% scaling up damage bonus. And then third, but perhaps most importantly for the wand, is Magic Missile, which is a 4 multi-hit moderate damage attack that costs 4 mana. So the way I would play out a turn here is probably just to go heavy mana casting and slap down some magic missiles here. Just do as much damage as I possibly can, and then use Sword of Damocles for the remainder. And that's going to segue well into, I think, the weaknesses of it. Its identity here is really high damage and get a bunch of multi-hit to make magic missiles ridiculous. But its big challenge is, especially in the early game, Transfer is going to be hard to utilize. You're often going to have this hero on their own on a side, and it is very difficult without spending a lot of mana. We spent our entire daily mana regen on just that 1 turn nearly in order just to use up our 6 action points. If we had not used it, we would have still had to spend 4 mana just to use up 6 action points, because we would have used 4 on Sword of Damocles and then kind of been done. So the problem with Wand is action point utilization, but the strength is that magic missiles, especially with high crit and high crit power, becomes an absolutely staggering killer. Like, one of the top tier builds is Magic Missile with just about anything, or Wand with just about anything. You can match Wand up with almost any other build. I think it pairs well with Hand Crossbow, which also benefits greatly from multi-hit, but also pairs well with Two-Handed Axe just for the damage buff, or Magic Orb so that you have a bit of isolation for taking out those big targets. There's a lot of ways that you can build it, and Transfer comes in surprisingly handy late game because of the increased movement points and action points. You can often push one of your heroes that little extra distance that they need to go to secure the kill that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. Next up is the Magic Orb, a item that I use with a great deal of regularity, but sometimes question whether it's as good as I think it is. So the orb's primary attack is Infect, which is a high isolation scaling, same as the Dagger, magic attack that deals 1 damage. That costs 1 action point. It has a skill range of 9 and can be used up to 5 times per turn. From my perspective, that makes it an exceptional offhand. Then you have Putrid Ball, which is doing moderate damage and poisoning everyone in a big circle for moderate poison damage. And then you finish off with Death Ray, which is just the ultimate straight line attack that just does big damage. So if I was starting out this turn just to get some isolated targets here for demonstration purposes, I might start out here and just cut these guys off at the knees. then hit this guy with an infect, take a step forward, hit this guy with an infect, and then maybe drop a putrid ball here to get these guys hurting a little bit. Now, in terms of identity, I think I already mentioned this, but I often see this as a stat item with a really advantageous base attack. I think Infect is very, very strong because I often am carrying some isolation on most of my heroes, and many of the magic orbs come with things like increased poison damage or increased isolation, which makes them pair well with things like Druid Staffs and Longbows and even hand crossbows, because you're going to pack a lot of punch with Infect. The occasional Death Ray is going to be useful, but mostly you're going to be relying on your secondary weapon to be doing most of the killing, and then the big things are going to need some extra oomph that Infect provides. The weakness is here that I don't think its identity is particularly good standalone. You need something else to make this thing, and so as a result, picking it up super early as a singular weapon is a bit of a challenge. The Magic Scepter is next on our list, and the Magic Scepter has been through quite a few iterations during early access, but the current form that it has landed on I think is pretty solid. Your bread and butter is Magic Bash. This previously did not have a range to it, but now does, but it comes with the highest momentum scaling in the game, I believe. Citation may be needed, and can be used up to 5 times per turn. So you have a lot of actions with it, and it's going to carry a large momentum multiplier. You then have Wind Walk, which is going to increase your movement by 3 and is self-targetable, unlike Transfer. And then last but not least, you have Hammer of Faith, which is a high propagate, high stun percentage, high damage ability for 3 mana. So if I were playing out this turn, I think I would probably just spam a lot of Magic Bashes, just kind of running along. And you can kind of see that 1 movement doesn't quite get me the kill on one of these, but 2 movement is enough. So I might move, actually I might move like this and then pick up this kill. And then we'll just toss in a Hammer of Faith just to demonstrate what that looks like. And then to run away, I might hit myself with a Wind Walk and run over here. The strength of this is unquestionably momentum. The Scepter is a great complement to almost any momentum build because it is one of, if not the best weapon for utilizing your movement. So you pair this with a sword that gives you a bunch of moves, and then you're doing large Magic Bashes, and then also the fact that it gives you some extra movement gives you a lot of flexibility. I very rarely use Hammer of Faith because I find that 5 Magic Bashes plus whatever I'm getting from the other weapon is more than enough to do what I need to do. The disadvantage is really just that it's a little one note. Like, I don't think that Hammer of Faith is really worth building into a stun build, but maybe there's a play for opportunism debuff type of build using Hammer of Faith as your primary stunner as opposed to, say, the two-handed hammer. But most of the time, I think we're focused on Magic Bash and then also Wind Walk, which can also be cast on other friendlies. I've already talked about it, but I think ultimately your best pairings are other momentum weapons like pistols or swords, and you might be able to get away with pairing it with some other kind of like stun synergy debuff type of builds. And now on to one of my favorites, the Druid Staff. And the Druid Staff comes with 4 abilities. We have Centipedes, that is a very high opportunism damage scaling attack. We have Entangle, which is the second best snare in the game after Suppressive Fire, targeting 9 as opposed to 10 units at a cost of 2 mana. We have Acid Spray, which is a large ball attack that reduces armor and dodge for 2 mana. And then we have Bees, which is a high propagate poison attack that costs 3 mana. So the Druid Staff's real identity, I think, comes from the bees. So if you've seen me play at all, one of the advantages of poison-based building in the last spell is that the poison tree, which is, or the poison column, which we do not have, is kind of standalone. It just kind of works all on its own. So you can just know if your character has poison perks and you have a Druid Staff, you're good to go for poison. But the way I'd play out a turn generally, especially early on, is I might Bee Sting and then I might pick off some other enemies, knowing that if there's a larger enemy, I have significantly more damage thanks to centipedes. And then I might go ahead and drop a snare on the back ones and then hit this guy because runners be runners. But the strengths of the Druid Staff is really its encapsulation and then bees. Even at 3 mana, bees with a bit of poison damage is staggeringly good. And if you get some propagation damage, or excuse me, some propagation bounces, you can be putting out absolutely staggering amounts of poison damage, like 500 plus poison damage a turn type of thing. And then also Centipedes is particularly strong and has a really nice opportunism scaling associated with it. And Entangle is just really useful for slowing down big things until they die to your poison. I don't have a lot of complaints about the Druid Staff. It's a little mana demanding now, thanks to Bee Sting having a 3 mana cost, but overall it's very strong. My go-to pair with this is a Magic Orb, because 1, Magic Orbs can come with increased poison damage, and then 2, having Isolation is a nice complement to having poison, so you have something to take out the big characters. As I mentioned before, I could also see this pairing pretty well with a Rifle, because you have that hip shot for picking off the bigger things, and you have suppressive fire as a second way of slowing things down. But overall, the Druid Staff is one of the top tier items, and oftentimes poison characters are my top damage dealers in runs. So for a long time, I really didn't like the Power Staff, but I am a convert at this point. So the Power Staff's value, from my perspective, to go through its abilities, starts with Pillar of Light, which is a single target accuracy debuffing in an area attack. And it's that debuff that is so powerful in Pillar of Light, because you're going to be debuffing up to 9 enemies that are directly in front of you. Next, you have Stunning Entrance, which is a fantastic movement ability. It costs 1 movement, 1 mana, and 1 action point, but it has vision, so you can travel anywhere within the diamond, assuming you get the kill, and you stun all of the enemies surrounding you, which makes it exceptionally good in stun-type builds as well. Then you have Scorching Wave, which is one of our 6-pack attacks, but it benefits 2 times by Opportunism, which is, I believe, the highest Opportunism scaling in the game. And it means that when you are hitting Opportunismed enemies with Scorching Wave, you're dealing a ton of damage for only 2 mana. And then last but not least, you have a triple swipe clone in Fire Thrower that I don't think is particularly transformative. But just to give you a sample of how I might play this, I might start out by hitting that guy. That gets us a debuff on all of these, which gives us a nice Scorching Wave here. Then let's say I wanted to be on the other side of things. I'll use Stunning Entrance to cross the chasm. And maybe I will finish this off with a mean old Fire Thrower to take all of them down. So, like I said, the Power Staff is an exceptional weapon. I am a huge fan. For a long time, I slept on it, but I think that it is incredibly powerful. And its power comes from the fact that Pillar of Light is an exceptional debuffer. Scorching Wave is an exceptional opportunism attack, and Stunning Entrance is an exceptional mobility attack. So it fits well into so many different builds. It is exceptional for opportunism stun debuff type builds. It's fantastic for anywhere that you can utilize Scorching Wave. And then it's great for enabling things like axes by being able to debuff a whole row of enemies really quickly. So Power Staff pairs with a ton of things, is really exceptional, and if you're not using it now, definitely consider adding it to your repertoire. And now, last and quite certainly least, at least in my eyes, is the Tome of Secrets. I kid though. I know that a lot of people have found great value in Tome of Secrets. I am just not one of them. But to go through its moves, you have Shadow Bolt, which is a long-range, moderately high damage attack that you can use up to 4 times per turn. You then have a debuff that has gotten a significant buff, but I'm still not that excited about it. But it reduces damage by 30%, resistance by 30%, and propagates up to 6 times. But it does no damage, and at 2 action points feels a little steep. You then have Fireball, one of my favorite, the plus symbol attack. And in this case, it is armor piercing, but at a cost of 4 mana, it's not cheap. And then last but not least, you have Lightning Strike at a cost of 6 mana, but having the highest number of propagates in the game at 9, it is a real bruiser. So if I were going to start this out, I might just start out by dropping a lightning bolt there and hoping that the propagate goes well. And then maybe I follow up with, can I find a better target for my fireball? Nope. Looks like I can only get 4 with it. And then I'll probably just take out these two with shadow bolts. Now, why don't I like Tome of Secrets? First bit is how expensive and how limited the mana abilities are. Both Fireball and Lightning Bolt being limited to 1 feels a little bit rough, and then 6 and 4 mana are both very expensive. Shadow Bolt being limited to 4, given that the other 2 are pretty weak, means that if you start out with a Tome of Secrets, you're really going to be casting 4 Shadow Bolts and then wishing that you had something else to spend your other 2 action points on, because you don't really want to bother with a weakening touch. But fundamentally, where this comes into its own is when you get higher level. Lightning Strike with a bunch of additional propagation bounces, with Mana Collector, with a variety of other things, high crit, high damage, can be absolutely devastating to enemy groups. So not to be slept on, but Weakening Touch is too expensive to be an enabler for opportunism. So it's really limited to that kind of like Mana Collector, high crit caster build. So you might pair it with something like a wand or a hand crossbow, especially a hand crossbow because you're going for heavy propagation bounces. You could also potentially put it with a Druid Staff. Maybe you could even make a play with Magic Scepter and go for like a Magic Scepter Tome of Secrets build where you're going for heavy propagate, heavy stun. But that's a bit out there from my perspective, and overall, I don't see a great deal of value in Tome of Secrets. Not to poo-poo it too much, but it's probably my least favorite weapon in the game. So that's all the weapons, at least all the primary hand weapons. The last thing to really talk about here are offhands, since there are 2 types of offhands, and we'll be breaking with the format a little bit here. But you have offhand weapons now, and you have shields. Basically, shields have no activated ability but come with stats and defensive attributes. And then your offhand weapons are going to be all of the versions of the one-handers that we talked about. So for instance, this is an offhand sword, and they are always going to come with the primary attack from that. So the 1 slot attack. So for instance, if we look at this axe, a offhand axe would have shred on it, but because this is a sword, it has slice. And the beauty of this is it will always show up on your bar with no action cost. So it will be 1 free action per turn if you choose to equip an offhanded weapon, and you have access to all of the offhands. There are offhands for all of the one-handers in the game. Took me a second to figure out how to explain that. But that basically does it for all of the weapons in the game. And picking the right weapons is incredibly important to your success in the last spell. Understanding the pairings and seeing synergies is really the key to the beginning of what the next video will be on, which is builds. So builds are a way to think about heroes as a template where you know what you're looking for, you know how you're trying to create them. And in the next video, I'm going to take 4 or 5 builds and kind of decompose them into the way that I think about them, how I level them up, what perks I need to make sure I have, etc. But before we do that, I wanted to talk more broadly about the way to identify pairings yourself as kind of like a final place to leave this video on, because I do not think that what I just did by going over all of the weapons in the game has illuminated for you every pairing that is potentially available. I think that what you need to be looking for is you need to be looking for either commonality or difference in weapons. And I know that that's like That sounds really stupid, but I promise there's a method to my madness. So what I mean by that is an example of commonality would be recognizing that Longbow and Magic Orb both benefit greatly from isolation. So if I'm building a hero with lots and lots of isolation, it is a great idea to pair those two up, because buying stats during my level ups for isolation is going to heavily benefit two of my weapons. Another example of that would be choosing to pair hand crossbow with wand, knowing that every time I pick up multi-hit on a piece of gear or multi-hit in a level up, it is benefiting both of those weapons equally, and those weapons both benefit greatly from crit and crit power. So it all plays relatively well together. But then I also said the benefit of difference. And this is where some of those pairings that I described, like Druid Staff and Magic Orb, come in, where sometimes you recognize that you have one weapon that is absolutely dominant in a domain. The Druid Staff is insanely good at wiping out cannon fodder, right? You know, if we were looking at the map here, the Druid Staff would take this whole cluster and reduce it to rubble. And if you had volatile reactions, it would potentially take all of these ones and take them out for a nominal cost. But what it's not great at is it's not great at taking out big enemies. And so that's where Magic Orb potentially comes in, because its isolation damage is a really nice counterbalance to the heavy wave clear of the other weapon. So that's what I mean. Right? Before you start to think about builds and kind of paint yourself into a corner, ask yourself, okay, what does a two-handed sword have going on? Well, it has some mobility and has some momentum. Maybe it pairs well with a magic scepter or Tome of Secrets. Really good on the propagation damage. Maybe I should consider using Tome of Secrets with the two-handed hammer, which also has a propagation attack. By finding those points of commonality, you're going to start to see ways that weapons synergize, and you can start to build with your level ups and with your other gearing into those points of overlap to create really powerful characters that have the ability to utilize all of their attacks. So with that, I have no idea how long this video is. If I look over here at OBS for just a moment, my OBS tells me that I've been recording for 1 hour and 30 minutes, because between every one of these weapon attacks, I had to Alt F4 out of the game, reload my save where I had gotten every weapon, and go through the rigmarole of setting up the wave and whatever. But anyways, I don't want to bore you with those details, but basically this is where we're going to leave this guide. We've talked about weapons. We've talked a little bit about how to think about pairing up weapons, and also just how weapons work, because fundamentally one of your greatest skills is going to be able to look at a shop, look at an item reward, and be like, oh, that weapon goes great with what I'm trying to do with this character. I'm so glad that it's there. And by making better decisions about the way that you gear up your heroes and being smart about the weapons that you are equipping with them, you're going to see great increases in the overall power and ability to decimate the horde that your heroes have. So I'm going to call it there. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this guide helpful or interesting, tossing me a like is incredibly helpful as always, and throwing me a sub would also be great. We just hit 1,000 subs, which feels incredible. So I wanted to take one moment to say thank you to everyone who has joined as part of the rush of subs for the 1.0 of The Last Spell. I'm going to be continuing to make more guides and also streaming it every Tuesday if you want to swing by and say hi. But for now, that's going to do it for me. I have to go get editing this video so that I can get it out by Sunday. But for now, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.